Good morning, dear students. I hope you have enjoyed the podcast lecture the last time, which was sent to you on periodontal assessment part 1. We have discussed on quite some topics on what important questions to be asked onto the patient when the patient comes to you, which relevant questions to be inquired in the case history, and then we have also seen what intraoral examination findings to be done, how to assess and examine the mucogingival problems. I have also covered how to examine the gingival features and how to actually do the intraoral hygiene assessment, patient's oral hygiene assessment, which indices to be used and how to be done. The procedures details of all the assessment procedures details in the indices have been covered. Lastly, I also have covered upon the BPA, which is the most important thing for everyday practice. Now, as a continuation to the topic, the last part of the lecture, which is the examination of the periodontium, is going to be covered in this lecture. Hence, as a continuation to the last part of the lecture, today we'll start with the examination of the heart tissues, which include, we have completed until the BPA. After BPA in your ENT form comes the heart tissue examination, right? So under heart tissue examination, whichever aspects are important from periodontal point of view or periodontal disease point of view, those aspects will be covered. Okay. Good morning, dear students. I hope you have enjoyed. Under heart tissue examination, the most common or the obvious relevant examination that can be done from periodontal point of view is presence of stains or presence of any deposits, any pigmentation in the stains. So stains and discolorations usually are very obvious. They are usually the patient may complain of anesthetic appearance and they can be easily detected. It is nothing, no great examination. You just perceive it visually and then maximum with the natural light sometimes and try to dry this area of the teeth and then perceive it, and it can be removed. Most of the stains can be removed with scaling. If not, certain situations where intrinsic staining is present, only thing you need to differentiate here is whether it is an intrinsic staining or whether it is an extrinsic staining. If it is an extrinsic staining like tobacco smoking or coffee tea stains and all, usually they can be removed by ultrasonic scaling or polishing. If there are intrinsic staining caused due to developmental abnormalities or because of the tetracycline staining or other inherited problems, then it could be difficult to completely remove them, or due to fluorosis, then possibly an advice on bleaching could be suggested as indicated to the patient depending upon how severe it is. So the first aspect when we want to actually talk about the heart tissue aspects that are relevant to periodontal disease includes occlusal examination. And the most important one is to assess the presence of trauma from occlusion. As you all know, this aspect is already covered when the lecture on trauma from occlusion was taught to you. So which test we are going to use? It is Fremitus test. So Fremitus test, what is a Fremitus test? Is nothing but basically a palpable or visible movement of tooth when subjected to occlusal forces. Whenever the teeth are clenched like this, then there could be some palpable movement observed in the teeth, right? So that palpation, or when you palpate that movement, when you feel those movements, you call it as Fremitus. So this vibratory pattern of the teeth, when the teeth are placed in the maximum contacting positions, are captured. So how to do this procedure, as you can see in the picture shown here, as you can see in the picture shown here, the patient is actually keeping the finger. Of course, nowadays with corona we have to use a glove finger, but sometimes it is also said that if you use a gloved finger, it may dampen the vibration. So in literature, in textbooks, sometimes it can be mentioned that try to use an ungloved finger. Okay, so either it is a gloved finger or ungloved finger, it has to be kept partially on the gingiva and partially on the teeth surface. And then you have to ask the patient to bite repeatedly or clench multiple times or tap on the teeth multiple times. When you do that, then you have to observe the vibration produced, or not only in the centric rotation but also in the lateral protrusive movements also. So if you feel some vibrations, that can be graded. Most important point is while you are checking the trauma from occlusion by Fremitus test, please make sure the patient sits in the upright position, and then the index finger is placed partially on gingiva or partially on the tooth surface or on the cervical area of the teeth, and you ask the patient to tap in the maximum intercuspal position. After you finish that, then in the lateral protrusive relations. Then the grading will be as follows, which will be discussed in the next slide. Depending upon the palpable movements, class 1 means mild vibrations or movements that are detected. Class 2 is easily palpable vibrations, but they can't be visible with the naked eye. If you observe like this, you can't really make out that the patient teeth are moving or vibrating, but you can feel the vibrations with your finger. Right, so grade 1 is mild vibrations are felt, grade 2 is easily palpable vibrations, but you can't still make it out with your naked eye, and grade 3 or the class 3 is basically where the movement can be even perceived with the naked eye. You can actually see the movement or the vibratory pattern observed. So this is actually Fremitus test grading. Under hard tissue examination findings, one of the most important relevant feature which we need to examine is proximal contacts. Proximal contacts have got a huge impact on periodontium because any slight open contact can cause a food impaction. Food impaction can lead to inflammation and even pocket formation, ultimately periodontal bone loss. So the tightness of the contacts, usually when we are verifying in a patient, the tightness of the contacts also can be verified by passing the dental floss, which you all know when you do your class 2 restorations and all, you do that, right? See, abnormal proximal contacts usually have got an impact, like for example, normally the proximal contacts are usually for the anterior teeth. The proximal contacts, as you can observe in this picture, the proximal contacts are present at the incisal third in the anterior teeth, like this, in the incisal third of the tooth surface. Whereas with the posterior teeth, the proximal contacts are present at the middle third of the teeth surface, the tooth surface at the contact point. So this is very, very important because when you are doing your class 2 restorations, especially proximal restorations, it is important to know where exactly to keep the contact point. One mistake in the contact point can lead to a lot of inflammation, food impaction, patient discomfort, and further consequences. So if abnormal contact relationships are present, then it can initiate occlusal changes also. Occlusal changes, like there could be a change in the midline between the central incisors, there could be a labial version of the canine, maxillary canine, and sometimes the teeth could bucco or lingual displacement of the posterior teeth is also observed, because based on the contact point, only the occlusal relations also will be followed, and sometimes there will be uneven marginal ridges that also can lead to food impaction. As you can see in this picture here, in the picture upright there, the marginal ridges, there is a proximal restoration that has been done, but unfortunately there is no marginal ridge, right? See, absence of this marginal ridge in such a situation usually causes food lodgement here. Food gets nicely impacted into the periodontium, into the gingival tissues there. So here the marginal ridge is there, but it is not compatible, or we should say it is very uneven. This ridge is at a higher level compared to the presence of this ridge. So this is uneven marginal ridges. Absence of an occlusal embrasure space. Here, no occlusal embrasure, tight contact, too tight contact. There is no, you can't even pass a floss there. And then thin marginal ridges. They try to create a marginal ridge, but it is so thin that it is not giving a proper enough contact point. So all these proximal contacts, or understanding and examining the presence of proper proximal contacts is very important. But you may ask me, doctor, how do I know that I need to verify the proximal contacts? See, it all depends on how good the history you take. When you are suspecting, when your BPE score shows a generalized periodontitis, probably you don't suspect. You yourself, when you examine the teeth, you know how well they're aligned, how well the teeth are, how many teeth have got the proximal restorations. All these things will give you a clue. But if at all there is only one or few areas, or very few areas as indicated by BPE 4 mm, the score of 4, that means it is not generalized periodontitis. Rather, only one or two teeth have got a deeper pockets, and that is causing a BPE score of 4. So what could they? That means it is not a periodontal disease per se. It could be some local factor there that is causing. In such situations, you may inquire the patient, is there any food impaction happening in any particular area? The patient may point to you, yes, I get food always gets stuck here. You can ask the patient about food impaction, if there is any food impaction, if at all the patient has got crowns, if at all the patient has got proximal restorations, if at all you find localized pockets on 1 or 2 teeth but rest of the teeth are healthy, if at all there is any drifting of the teeth or a spacing of the teeth present. In all these situations, if you inquire, patient gives you a clue, yeah, I get food, you get stuck here usually. In that area, at least you can check for the proper proximal contacts, if not elsewhere. It is good if you can check everywhere as well. As just now explained, the importance of a contact cannot be underestimated. The proper proximal contact, it preserves the stability and integrity of the arch, and it also maintains a normal mesiodistal relationship of the teeth. One contact, if it is not there, tooth starts drifting right into the space. So it prevents a food impaction interdentally. It also protects the soft tissue from periodontal disease. If there is food impaction, that leads to periodontal pocket and further periodontal bone loss. So if you have proper contacts, all these can be prevented. And it also conserve the teeth from the proximal caries. Even the proximal plaque and proximal food impaction can lead to a caries formation, right? That can be avoided. And premature restorative failure does not occur if a stable contact is present. When you are restoring the teeth, the proximal restorations, and if at all you give a proper nice contact there, then the failure of the restoration usually does not happen. So all these are the important features or the important functions of having a good proper proximal contact. So the importance of it cannot be underestimated. And here I have shown you in the picture few of the examples of how the contact points are located. You can see here, for example, in the picture here, the contact is there, but you see the contact is too broad. Usually we don't, it is not good to have such a broad contact point. The broad contact point, if it is too broad, occluso gingivally also, like this also, and it also buccolingually also. See, any contact point has got two directions. One is mesiodistally and as well as occlusogingivally. So both these things you have to check how is the proximal contact. Because food can stuck not only vertically, food impaction can also happen laterally also, right? So laterally, the mesiodistally also, how is a proximal contact, I mean buccolingually also have to be verified. So these things are very important. Now here is too broad in both these examples, and here the contact point is too thin, right? This also can lead to a food impaction, and contact is present, but the contact is present too much occlusively, right? And this will cause lateral food impaction. Now contact is too much buccal surface, right? Then contact is present too lingual, contact present too occlusal, like open contact. This is a clear classic example of a open contact. In fact, open contacts can be clearly even seen in the clinically in the patient, and also in the radiographs also can help you in order to identify some of the proximal contacts, open contacts especially. See, the contact with too much of convexity and the contact with too much of concavity. See, all these different types of which none of them are ideal. So good ideal contact point is a challenge to establish, but once established, it really maintains a proper arch integrity. However, clinically in the patient, if the contact point, if you have identified any abnormality and the patient is showing some symptom due to the abnormal contact point, then only we usually intervene. Otherwise, we don't usually intervene. Another important aspect we need to examine under the hard tissue findings include drifting, presence of drifting, and pathologic tooth migrations. See, drifting is basically whenever there is a long span edentulous area which has been left unreplaced due to missing teeth, then definitely the teeth have got natural tendency, the posteriors, to drift mesially. So you can see in the panoramic radiograph here, there is a missing molar tooth here, and then into this missing molar space, the 7, that means the 4-7, and is getting drifted, and there is no more space available to be replaced also. So if I imagine now, due to such a drifting, what will happen? The upper molar, which is the 1-6, do you think the forces acting on this 4-7 will be acting parallel to the long axis of the tooth? Will the force fall exactly parallel to the long axis of the tooth? Definitely not. So there will be lateral forces. So due to the lateral forces, you can also observe there is some amount of bone loss that is observed here, right? Angular bone loss, possibly due to some amount of trauma from occlusion. So here also there are missing teeth and there is a drifting that can be observed. There is also some amount of pathologic migration because it is a case of periodontitis. The teeth are actually flaring and moving off, and there is spacing between the teeth. Where is the presence of contacts here? Most of the teeth have got open contacts, isn't it? So these things actually also affect or worsen the existing condition of the patient, and the patient chewing capacity or the masticatory efficiency also could be compromised. Especially you can observe in the second picture here also an example where there is missing molar and this space was never replaced. So there what happens is the tooth falls into this space, drifts into this space of molar, and what also happens is the upper tooth drifts down, which is supra-eruption. So there are two problems. One is the mesial drift of the adjacent tooth and also the supra-eruption of the opposing tooth. So both of these things will happen. Once the supra-eruption of the opposing tooth happens, there is no proper contact of the marginal ridge there with the adjacent upper tooth, right? For example, imagine you can see here, if this is supra-erupted in this particular tooth, if at all it is, I'll take another color. Okay. See this particular tooth, if it is supra-erupting, do you think the proximal contact integrity is maintained here? The marginal ridges, won't it be uneven again? Yes. So there will be effect on both upper and as well as lower, isn't it? So here you can see that this particular tooth also, the forces are not really falling on the nice cuspal fossa relation is not there anymore, and the upper tooth is also drifting down, and a space can open here and which can cause, in this space there could be a foot trapment. Even here also there could be a foot trapment also. So these are the common problems that can lead to further and further breakdown of the tissues. Not only the breakdown of the tissues, not only compromising the masticatory efficiency, the tooth in that area, once all these things are happening, it will be very difficult from prosthetic point of view to replace that area again, because once drifting spaces are occupied, once the drifting happens, the spaces are occupied, there is no more space in order to give a proper prosthesis there, whether it is a removable prosthesis or a fixed prosthesis. So it is very important in order to make sure to train and motivate the patient to make sure that they replace the teeth as and when they are actually lost, not waiting for a long time. Okay. How does a pathologic migration happens? See, pathologic migration and drifting, there is two different things. Drifting can be physiologic drifting. Whenever there is a missing space, a healthy tooth also can drift into that space. That is physiological drifting. Whereas pathologic migration means the tooth displacement results when the balance between the factors that maintain its normal physiological tooth position is disturbed due to the periodontal disease. That means the tooth in question, whatever we are talking to or referring to, already has a bone loss, already has got a bone loss, and therefore it is not supported enough that other factors can easily move its position. So this is called as pathologic tooth migration. As you can observe here in this picture, if you can see, there are the position of the tooth, which factors usually influence. It is usually influenced by the amount of granulation tissue and the amount of gingival enlargement that is present, the tongue movements, right, the movement of the tongue. That's why I said tongue thrusting is one of the important factors sometimes to be examined also. Masticatory and occlusal forces, lower lip competence and lower lip, how it is positioned, and also the other habits. See, all these upper lip here, so all these factors usually guide a tooth position, especially I'm talking about the incisors. And the incisors have a tendency for distolabial migration. They move distally and labially. That's why you see a lot of spacing in the pictures. So the causes for this pathologic migration can also be periodontal disease, can also be trauma from occlusion, can also be tongue thrusting. It depends upon what is actually happening. But in pathologic tooth migration, definitely the tooth is already weakened due to periodontal disease. As an example of pathologic tooth migration, you can see here in this picture the distolabial, the distally and labially the teeth are actually flaring away. So this is also a classic example of distolabial flaring or pathologic tooth migration. Another example here is a missing tooth present here, and the missing tooth is causing supra-eruption of the upper molar, and also from the adjacent drifting from the adjacent molar also is drifting into this space. You see, as I told you, there are two problems. One from the supra-eruption, which causes there there is no marginal contact or proximal contact will be lost over here, and also this one also will be drifting over here. So these points have to be kept in mind whenever we are examining the patients in that local area, or a localized inflammation or localized pockets are present, localized areas of foot trapment are present. So try to consider and look into the hard tissue proper examination of the contacts, drifting, migration, missing teeth, and put together all the findings in order to conclude what exactly is the problem there. Of course, malalignment. Malalignment includes, it's majorly an orthodontic finding, right? Malalignment can include malocclusion, can include crowding of the teeth, can include rotation of the teeth, or it can include labial position, palatally positioned teeth, or sometimes the teeth are actually placed with a cross bite, overjet, overbite. All these usually you learn under the orthodontic, how to examine the patient under for relevant orthodontic findings. However, in the presence of any of these malocclusion findings or malalignment findings, example, the most common thing which I talk about is a crowding. See, in such situations, what happens is when the patient has got crowding, definitely the ability to clean all the surfaces is compromised. So once there is more and more plaque accumulation, there is more chance of getting the attachment loss and inflammation, right? So this is due to the poor oral hygiene, but the contributing factor is the crowding there. So any malalignment, whether it is rotated tooth or malaligned teeth, are also predisposed to certain kinds of accumulation. As you can see here, there is also a lot of accumulation of the plaque or the calculus deposits over there. This slide shows you some of the examples where there is long span edentulous arches with missing teeth, and then there is a supra-eruption of the teeth over here, supra-eruption of the teeth here, which may eventually cause some amount of, in this second radiograph, you can clearly see that the occlusal, apart from the supra-eruption, the occlusal forces probably might have caused such amount of bone loss, yes, aggravated angular bone loss, which caused even extending until the apex of the tooth, right? So all these are some of the classic examples of a hard tissue abnormalities like proximal contacts, traumatic occlusion, drifting of the teeth, and pathologic migration, alignment of teeth. All these things needs to be thoroughly examined. One other important aspect is presence of, if at all the patient already has some restorations. In case if the patient already has some restorations, please do not forget to check the presence of overhang margins, right? The overhang margins, as you can see in this example, clinically, if there is a proximal contact, check for not only the kind of proximal contact, but also do check the presence of any overhang presence. If there is an overhang margin, that can lead to the food impaction, that can lead to plaque accumulation and thereby marginal inflammation in that area also. So this is a classic example. Overhang margins, if you can't make it, overhang margins can be detected by passing the floss in that area through the restoration, but sometimes more often overhang margins can be incidentally detected in the radiographs. If you take radiographs for other reasons, usually you can also identify the presence of an overhang margin, as you can see here. Plunger cusp. Another important point is presence of plunger cusp. Actually, yes, uneven marginal ridges and all these things also will cause food impaction, proximal contacts and all, open contacts and all. But plunger cusp is nothing but here you can see this is what is the plunger cusp. Instead of falling into the cusp and fossa relation, this is falling in between the two teeth. This is the cusp that actually causes the food impaction. It forces the food to lodge into the area in between and thereby causes the food impaction. Such cusps are called as plunger cusp. So please do examine for the presence of any plunger cusp in case the patient complains of food lodgement or food stuck between the teeth very often. Once you finish your hard tissue examination, thereafter in your UNT you follow the caries and then the investigations and diagnosis. But for periodontal examination based on your BPE, you have to follow up with the complete periodontal charting, right? If there is a score of 4 or even if it is a score of 3, you may have to do if it is a score of 3, you will do a sextant. In that particular sextant, periodontal charting, or if it is a score of 4, then you will do a complete periodontal examination of the full mouth. So let us see how to examine the periodontium. What are the factors? What all the information we can get from the periodontal examination? from the pocket depth examination. See, from pockets, whenever we measure, we usually do not only detect the presence of pocket, we see which site have got pockets, we see how much is the measurement of the pocket, we also see what is the type of the pocket that is present there, whether it is a simple wide pocket, complex pocket, or I mean like a spiral pocket, or if there is a discharge in that area, any sinus present, any pus exudate that is can be seen from the pocket, you can also observe. And usually for the instruments that are used in order to check the pocket depth are periodontal probe like Williams probe and UNC probes are usually can be used. WHO probe is used to detect the presence of pocket, but you cannot measure the depth of the pocket, as I have told before. So preferably you have a Williams probe or UNC probe whenever you want to measure the pocket, whenever you are doing a periodontal charting. I have seen some of the students in previously when we used to teach them, they get used to WHO probe, and therefore they take WHO probe and they go on probing all the sites in the patient, and ultimately when doctor come and checks it is not accurate, so you may have to reprobe the patient, which is much more invasive, right? So do avoid such mistakes. So whenever we are probing, let us see how many sites we have to probe. It is usually the 6 sites we are going to probe. Let us go in details of the one by one. The first among the various periodontal examinations which we need to do is the verifying the presence of periodontal pocket by probing technique. So what is a pocket? Pocket is a pathologically deepened gingival sulcus. How you know whether it is a pocket or normal sulcus? If you measure it and if it is more than 3 mm, it can be considered as a pocket. So as I told you, you have to use UNC or UNC or Williams probe in order to measure the pocket depth. Now let us see what is actually a pocket and how to measure the pocket depth exactly, from where to where it actually extends. See, as you can see in the given picture here, see the pocket actually extends from gingival margin. There are 2 kinds. Normally the histologic pocket depth means the actual distance from gingival margin and the anatomical distance where the tissues are attached again back to the tooth surface, the cementum. So this is actually the pocket depth. But when we really probe with a periodontal probe, the probe may not really reach until this extent. The probe may stop only until here or here, right? So it depends. So it depends on various factors which we will look into it later. So that is the reason the probing pocket depth we will say. We don't say the actual pocket depth. When we probe whatever the depth we can measure, that is called as probing pocket depth or clinical pocket depth, and that is nothing but the penetration of the probe from the gingival margin. So if the probe penetrates until here and from the gingival margin, so that will be the probing pocket depth. Okay, in the second picture you can also observe that the probe penetrates about 1/3 to half the length of the junctional epithelium here. Although the actual attachment is here, the probe is penetrating only until here, isn't it? Whereas in the second picture, if you can see the the periodontal pocket with a short junction epithelium, the probe penetrates beyond the apical end of the junction epithelium also. See, so these factors depends upon the inflammation, tissue resistance and all, how much the pocket is actually, the probe is actually passing into the pocket. That is what is called as probing pocket depth or clinical pocket depth. The technique of probing pocket depth includes basically you have to use a probe, the periodontal probe, UNC or W. Williams probe, and then you can insert, the probe should be inserted parallel to the vertical axis of the tooth, as you can see in the picture here. This is the long axis of the tooth. Parallel to the long axis of the tooth, the probe has to be inserted. Okay, and the probe, once you insert the probe has to be walked circumferentially around each surface of the tooth in 1 millimeter increments. That means you can see here, without no need to take out the probe completely out of the gingiva or the pocket, you just have to walk the probe like this. Keep walking the probe. That means you insert once like this and you keep moving until you feel. Why we are walking 1 mm? Because we are not sure where is the deepest pocket that is present in the tooth, right? So we usually want to detect and capture the deepest probing depth. So in order to not to miss the deepest pocket depth, we go on, pocket probing is done in 1 millimeter increments circumferentially all around the tooth. Okay, and whenever we are doing this, we measure the depth of the pocket from the gingival margin and wherever the base of the pocket is, or wherever the probe goes, until wherever the probe goes. So usually you read whatever at the gingival margin, the calibration of the probe, the reading at the probe or present on the probe, it will be recorded as the probing pocket measurement. And when you are doing this, usually it is measured at 6 sites per each tooth. So what are the 6 sites? The 6 sites include okay, I show here, mesial-buccal, mid-buccal, distal-buccal. At the same time, similarly on all the other 3 sites like mid-palatal, mesial-palatal and distal-palatal. So in each tooth, 6 sites are actually supposed to be recorded for the pocket depth, and you have to record the deepest pocket. So how will you know which is the deepest pocket? When you walk around the probe in 1 millimeter increment by keeping the probe in the long axis of the tooth, parallel to the long axis of the tooth, then you can evaluate it. Then you may also ask me then, like for example, which are the what is the amount of force we are supposed to use when we are probing. Usually the probing force is considered to be, that is safer to be used, is usually 0.75 newtons. Let us see whether we can measure it or not. Before going to the probing force and other factors that affect probing depth, if at all there is a contact point like this, in this picture you can see that here the 2 teeth are contacted. Once there is a contact point, you can't put the probe in parallel to the long axis of the tooth, right? In the proximal zone, you cannot insert the probe in the parallel to the long axis of the tooth. In such situation, you can actually tilt the probe slightly in order to access the deepest probing depth. You are allowed to slightly tilt the probe so that if the 2 teeth are contacting like this, you cannot put the probe, so you slightly tilt the probe in order to access the deep pocket depth. As mentioned, the presence of pocket is one of the very significant sign of presence of periodontal disease or periodontitis actually. And however, even without measuring the pocket, can we identify if there is a pocket or not without probing? Although there is the probing is a better way and ideal way of understanding the amount of probing depth, the amount of attachment loss that has happened. Usually the signs and symptoms correlated with the periodontal disease include, it should generally painless. Periodontal disease, the presence of pocket won't have any specific pain unless there could be some itchy sensation, some sensation of pressure after eating, or a foul taste in the localized areas, or sensitivity to hot and cold. But although, as I said, the probing is the only reliable method, these are the symptoms, okay? These are all the patient's symptoms, what the patient feel if at all there are pockets present. Some signs which as a clinician you can actually suspect that there could be a pocket present in case if at all you see there are some color changes on the gingiva, which could be a bluish red margin or bluish red vertical zone, and rolled gingival margins. If at all there is enlarged edematous gingiva, there is a severe bleeding present or suppuration present, that means pus exudate present, or if there is a loose and extruded teeth are present. In such situations, there is every chance that it is associated with the periodontal pocket in that area. So when you identify these features clinically, take a probe and then probe it there, definitely you will identify a pocket. Okay, so without probing also, to certain extent you can actually try to identify, yes, this is a zone where it is indicating that the pocket could be present. Now I was keep on telling you that there are some factors that affect the probing depth measurement actually. So let us look into what are these factors. Basically, first one is the amount of force that you can apply. The force that you can actually apply on in order to measure the probing depth. If you apply more force, definitely the probe can sink in, right? You may create a pocket even though there is no pocket, right? You may rupture the junction epithelium. So this probing force should be optimum. It should not be more than 25 grams or 0.75 newtons usually, which is a tolerable limit. And it also depends upon the direction or the angulation of the probe, okay? And if you angulate the probe, then accordingly the measurement or the calibration of the probe also the reading can be varied accordingly. Probe tip diameter, as you know that if at all the probe tip is so blunt and so wider diameter probe if you take, will the probe go into the gingiva easily or the soft pocket easily? It doesn't go, right? The more the diameter, the less the probing depth you can record. I mean, the probe may not go, but at the same time, the probe diameter should not be so thin that it overestimates the probing depth. It should not overestimate, it should not be underestimating. So ideal probing depth, the ideal probe diameters also should be is very, very important. And also the resistance of the tissues. For resistance of the tissues, if the tissues are very inflamed like this, as you can see in this picture, the tissues are actually so inflamed here, so inflamed, you can see the edematous gingiva, you can see so flaccid gingiva, soggy, puffy, right? So in such situations, what happens is the resistance of the tissues, because the fibers are all actually already disintegrated there, and the tissues have broken down, attachment loss is there inside, therefore there is no tenacity, there is no firm gingiva there, therefore it doesn't offer any resistance. That is what we call tissue resistance. So the tissue resistance, whenever it is not there, the probe happily can sink inside, and maybe the estimated probing depth could be more than when compared to the healthy tissues like this. If you can see in this picture, the tissues are very pale, tenacious, firm and resilient like this. In such gingiva, the probe may not really go as much as expected, or it will have, the tissue will have good resistance, and it will just show only what it can, the tissue can yield only. It may not, the probe is not very easy to penetrate into the tissues, right? So these factors like tissue resistance is also one of the important factor that affects the probing depth measurement. Another important factor is the convexity of the crown. Convexity of the crown is like, for example, if a very bulbous, convex or over-contoured crown is present, the probe angulation, the probe, you cannot put it so parallelly to the tooth surface. Therefore, it may lead to underestimation of the probing depth also. And as I said, here you can see in this picture the probe tip diameter, accordingly the measurements or the penetration of the probe may alter. Patient comfort and tolerance, although it is not a major factor or it should not really affect, if you have to make the patient comfortable, you can give anesthesia and all, I agree. But if a patient, if you're not using any anesthesia and all, but generally for probing we don't really use anesthesia, it's not really recommended. It is something a bearable, what you call, within the tolerable limit only, the amount of discomfort whatever is there due to the probing. Some patients even don't even have any pain while probing also, they're very comfortable there because attachment is already lost, they don't really have any much. But actually more sensitive will be in cases like this where the tissue is very healthy, it will be very sensitive usually. In the real periodontal cases, they may not be really having much pain. It depends anyway from case to case basis. If the patients are very extremely sensitive, yeah, it may not be so comfortable and it may affect the to certain extent of the probing depth. So from the probing measurements, what information do we get? As I just explained just before starting the probing things, we can get an information basically about the pocket depth probing, the bleeding on probing. We can know amount of bleeding on probing. We can also estimate the amount of attachment loss. We can also see whether there are any root deposits on the subgingival calculus present or not on the root also. We can feel it while you are probing. We can also check the configuration or type of the pocket or which surface there is the pocket present. The bone sounding means to see the topography of the alveolar crest. That also can be done while you are probing. And anatomy of the root, to certain extent, anatomy of the root, any furcation involvement, all that also, all this information you can obtain if you can do a proper probing technique. Hence, it is very, very, very important for you all to learn proper probing technique. Okay. Now let us look into the another periodontal examination parameter, which is gingival recession. Gingival recession is defined as the apical migration of the gingival margin below the cemento-enamel junction, which results in the exposure of the root surface. So this gingival recession is usually characterized by displacement of the margin below the CEJ, right? So it could be also from the former location of the CEJ in which restorations have distorted the location or appearance of the CEJ. It may be localized or generalized. So sometimes if at all the location of CEJ is not there, then you can relate to the restoration margin also, okay, for considering the amount of gingival recession or whether there is gingival recession present or not. This gingival recession can be localized to few teeth or single tooth, or it could be present on multiple teeth. Now let us see how to examine gingival recession. You can see in this picture which shows that the gingival recession is actually present only on the single tooth over here, but here you can see there is multiple teeth which have got the gingival recession. In assessing the gingival recession, the careful history of the condition and that needs to be taken is very important in order to understand, and the etiology of the recession has to be first identified. What actually is causing this kind of recession has to be first identified. So for that, some information could probably be verified, like for example whether there is any traumatic toothbrushing habit, whether there is any high frenal pull, whether there is any treatment done before, all these or any orthodontic treatment done before. All these things could help in getting the information on what actually has predisposed to the amount of gingival recession that is presented clinically. Among the various factors that can lead to gingival recession, some of them I have presented here. It could be like thin gingival phenotype. Yesterday, the other class in the part 1, I have told you about the gingival phenotype as a mucogingival problem, which could be thick gingival phenotype or a thin gingival phenotype. And I've told you that if the patient has got a thick phenotype, that's fine, because usually the gingiva has got good amount of barrier. Therefore, the gingiva won't really come down very fast. It has got enough tough resistance. Therefore, it doesn't yield to it doesn't collapse faster and becomes a recession. But whereas if the gingiva is very thin, there will be gingival recession very easily manifested. So if at all there is a thin gingival phenotype and the patient has got a traumatic tooth brushing habit, or if there is any labial orthodontic movement that has been done, or if at all even there is a abnormal frenal pull, or if there is even a tooth malposition that has led to the dehiscence or fenestration of the alveolar bone, and then thereby a thin phenotype, all these factors can lead to gingival recession. I mean to say, like in case, if for example, if there is a tooth malposition, the teeth are actually very labially placed. Okay, that one of the tooth, imagine it is labially malpositioned. Once the true root is labially malpositioned, then what happens? The amount of bone that is covering on the root surface will be very, very thin. The alveolar cortical bone will be very thin. Therefore, there could be a dehiscence, or there could be a fenestration, or the phenotype of the gingiva that is covering also will be very thin. So any traumatic brushing or frenal pull or any abrasion, it can easily lead to the gingival recession in that situation. So inadequate attached gingiva was also considered one of the predisposing factors for the causing gingival recession. And I told you all these factors. Of course, among all these factors, without any of these things also, sometimes even with presence of periodontitis, inflammation, calculus deposition due to the plaque formation, calculus and inflammation can also lead to the gingival recession. So now, since periodontitis is also one of the cause of gingival recession, you also have to rule out and know how to examine gingival recession. The difference in, if at all you want to see in which patients usually we get recession among periodontitis cases, and in which patients we get pockets. In those patients who usually have got a thick phenotype, the tissue won't recede so fast, right? It has got good enough barrier, as I said. Therefore, usually you see a periodontal pocket. But whereas in the thin phenotypes, if there is a periodontal inflammation, usually the tissue tends to undergo gingival recession, especially on multiple teeth. So this is one of the signs that say, so the phenotype of gingiva has got a major important role in which predisposes to the presence of gingival recession. The assessment of gingival recession is briefly summarized in this table. As you can see that the etiological factor, if at all the chronic trauma, as in case of the vigorous tooth brushing, is suspected, in that case then the habitual trauma such as picking at the gums, even the tooth picking at the gums or the tongue studs, also can cause any kind of recession. Usually in such situations, how the gingiva will be, very healthy. Usually no much inflammation can be seen, and it could be associated with only thin gingival phenotype. If at all the phenotype or the gingival biotype is the cause, as I said, the thickness of gingiva varies considerably between the patients, and at different sites in the same patient also they can have different types of phenotype. So typically on the labial surfaces of the lower incisors and the upper canines because the root is very prominent, usually they have a thin phenotype, and even in the lower incisor region also, the phenotype of the gingiva will be usually very thin. So these are more prone for the gingival recession. Malocclusion, any proclination, rotation of the teeth, which causes the outside presence of the root surfaces outside the bony envelope of the jaws, that can also create the bony dehiscence and thereby the gingival recession. Frenum, of course, high frenal attachment, as we have mentioned during the last class about the types of frenum, papillary and the papillary penetrating type of frenum. The frenal pull may directly enhance the recession, but also not only it enhances the recession, but it also impairs the proper plaque control. And periodontal diseases itself can cause pocketing, but if at all there is a thin phenotype, that can cause even gingival recession. But in this case where periodontal disease is actually causing the gingival recession, usually the gingiva will be inflamed and there will be a lot of plaque accumulation that is usually evident. It is also reported that gingival recession is usually associated more in smoking patients, and post-treatment after periodontal therapy, especially after surgical periodontal therapy, some form of gingival recession could be anticipated due to the shrinkage of the gingiva. What actually clinical problems the patient may face when there is gingival recession? The problems associated with gingival recession may include progression of the recession, ultimately involving into the tooth loss. If the total attachment loss can lead to the tooth loss, or if it goes until the apex of the root, it may cause endodontic involvement also. And of course, when there is so much of root exposure, there will be dentin hypersensitivity. The high chance of root caries will be there. First, and moreover, the patient will have very anesthetic appearance, right? And also there could be tooth surface loss like erosion and abrasion. Once the root surface is exposed, it can be easily prone to the erosion or the abrasions by means of the brushing and other habits also. Now let us look into the various types of the gingival recession classification. One of the classification that usually can be easily applied is Sullivan's and Atkins classification. According to the Sullivan's and Atkins classification, there are 4 types of gingival recessions, which are, as you can see in the picture, shallow narrow, shallow wide, deep narrow and deep wide. Okay, as the name is clearly explaining itself, the shallow and narrow, the recession is actually narrow, and as it is very shallow, it is not even extending beyond the mucogingival junction. Wide means it is wider, but it is still within the mucogingival junction. It does not extend beyond the mucogingival junction. Deep recessions are those that extend beyond the mucogingival junction, as you can see in these pictures. And however, deep is narrow here, and deeper and wider, which are extending beyond the mucogingival junction and are also wider. So among these 4 types of gingival recession, if at all you want to do a surgery and cover back the exposed root surfaces, which of the procedure, among the 4 types of gingival recession will be more promising to get covered back? Yeah, definitely the shallow narrow will have high chances of getting the coverage back, right? So while we do the root coverage procedures means those procedures, so there are surgical soft tissue coverage procedures which can be used in order to cover the exposed root surfaces. Among those coverage procedures, if at all we do those, but still the predictability of getting the 100% good outcome or 100% good coverage, it depends on the type of gingival recession. It depends on the case selection, right? So when we select which one has got a high predictability of or high promising outcome, then definitely the first one should be the shallow narrow, because it is very narrow, it is very shallow, it is not even deeper, followed by possibly the deeper narrow or shallow wide one. Of course, shallow deep wide one would be the least predictable outcome for a root coverage procedure. Now let us look into the most important classification system for gingival recession, which is called as Miller's classification. According to the Miller's classification, there are 4 types of recession categories. One is class 1, class 2, 3 and 4. Class 1 is, as you can see in the picture, the class 1 gingival recession means it is a recession where it does not extend beyond the mucogingival junction, and there is no periodontal bone loss, and there is no in the interdental areas there is no bone loss, and there is no soft tissue loss also. Only on the root surface, on the labial or the facial root surface, there is a little gingival recession. It is not even extending beyond the mucogingival junction. This is class 1. Class 2 recession means it extends up to the mucogingival junction, it extends to or even slightly beyond the mucogingival junction, but still there is papilla intact. That means the interdental bone is also intact. There is no loss of papilla or interdental bone. Class 3 gingival recession means recession extends to or beyond the mucogingival junction like this. It's same like class 2. However, there could be associated with some amount of, you see here, some amount of tissue loss or some amount of bone loss, or sometimes there could be malposition or labial position of the tooth. A little labial position of the tooth could be expected. That becomes class 3. Class 4 recession is extends beyond 2 or definitely 2 or beyond the mucogingival junction, but with severe bone loss, severe attachment loss, and also severe malposition of the tooth. As you can see in this case, there is complete papillary loss, complete bone loss that can be evident interdentally. And this kind of classification, this kind of category comes under class 4 Miller's recession. So identifying, whenever you are assessing gingival recession in the patient, the moment you see the gingival recession, you should be able to identify whether it belongs to class 1, 2 or 3 or 4. Miller's classification is expected in your undergrad curriculum. So any recession, you try to analyze whether it belongs to which of the following. Again, when I look into the root coverage procedures, which among the following will have high predictability of high chances of getting completely covered? Of course, class 1, because there is no loss and it is very easy, not even extending until the mucogingival junction. Followed by class 2, and possibly to certain extent class 3 is 50-50 sort of thing. But class 4, it is very poor predictable. The chances of getting the recession covered will be very low or very poor or almost no chances. So that's why we don't attempt root coverage procedures or surgeries to cover the root surfaces back, even though there is recession in class 4 cases, and only selective class 3 cases we can try. Class 1 and class 2, you can definitely try to do the coverage procedures. Now, after finishing the pocket and gingival recession, the third important parameter to examine the periodontium is the tooth mobility. Of course, this is very simple, easy parameter to assess, but only most important point you all have to remember is do not do it with a probe, right? The tooth mobility have to be assessed using the two mirror hand, the end of the back of the mouth mirror and also the back of a probe or any other handle mirror. So use the both and back ends of the instruments, or one finger and one instrument you can use, and then gently pull the teeth on both the sides, apply the pressure on both sides buccolingually, and try to see or mesiodistally and see whether the tooth is moving and how much is the mobility. To grade the mobility, you can use the Miller's index. Most commonly used is the Miller's index. It can be graded as 0, 1, 2 and 3. Normal physiological mobility in only horizontal direction is considered as grade with 0.1 to 0.8. Even the lower anterior teeth usually also tend to, because they're single-rooted teeth, and they may have some early morning tooth mobility when they're in hypofunction, because the whole night you are not chewing, or any active mastication won't be there. They tend to show some amount of physiological mobility, which is very normal. It is not pathological. So that physiological tooth mobility, a little very minor mobility, can be seen even under healthy conditions. That is called as physiological tooth mobility, which we still grade it as 0. Now 1 means movement up to 1 mm in the horizontal plane, either in the buccolingual direction or in the mesial distal direction. If there is movement until 1 mm, then that can be considered as grade 1 mobility. Grade 2 mobility, when there is movement more than 1 mm in the horizontal plane, either buccolingually or mesiodistally 1 to 2 mm, that you consider as grade 2, and even more than that you consider as grade 3. But also not only buccolingual, mesiodistal, but there will be a vertical depressibility into the socket. The tooth can be vertically, if you tap the tooth vertically into the socket, the tooth will also move vertically up and down into the socket. So this vertical depressibility is a classic sign of the grade 3 mobility. So clinical methods, as you can see here, you can see the two back handles of the instrument being used here, one finger and as well as one handle of the instrument being used to assess the mobility. So the mirror handle has to be used on one side, and then here they have applied the finger on the other side and gently push the tooth on either sides and elicit the tooth mobility. This picture shows the use of period test, an instrument which is also used to assess the tooth mobility. The fourth important parameter under the examination of periodontium is furcation involvement. Of course, furcation of involvement itself is a topic for you, and it has been well covered, I believe, recently. So I just touch on briefly the points that is necessary for clinical assessment of furcation involvement. The first thing is the probe that has to be used for furcation involvement measurement is called Nabors probe. Okay, so this Nabors probe also will have some color codings. Every 3 millimeters there will be a color coding, as you can see, one black band and the second black band. The difference is 3 mm, and 3, 6, 9 and 12. Okay, 3, 6, 9 and 12, that will be the probing calibration. And furcation involvement, if at all you want to verify, you have to use this probe, and you have to, it is a double-sided probe. It is in the opposite directions. The curvature will be in the opposite directions, and whenever there is a furcation involvement like this anatomically, then you need to probe into the furcation involvement, and you have to grade it whether it belongs to Glickman's classification grade 1, 2, 3 and 4. In grade 1 there is only incipient or early lesion. Cul-de-sac means one side there is furcation, but the other side still there is interradicular bone, not interradicular bone is still retained on one side, but on the buccal side, for example, there is loss of bone, but interradicular in between the roots, but lingually there is still bone. Then it is like a cave, right? It is like a cul-de-sac. Okay, that is grade 2 furcation involvement. Grade 3 furcation involvement is on both the sides, buccally and lingually there is loss of bone. Then you can see the probe through and through. When you pass from buccal side, you can see the probe lingually as well. And grade 4 also is through and through, but the only difference is the clinically the gingiva is also receded. Therefore, you can see the furcation open to the clinical environment into the oral cavity as well. In this picture, it clearly indicates what is the grade 3 furcation involvement. Just now, as I told you, when you probe into the grade 3 furcation involvement buccally, the probe can be seen even lingually here. So this is a classic example of grade 3 furcation involvement, but you can see that there is no exposure of the furcation into the clinical environment, I mean the oral cavity. There is no recession of the gingiva. So it is still grade 3. As long as the gingiva is covering the furcation involvement, it is still grade 3. Once the gingiva is also receded and the furcation is exposed, then you call it as grade 4. So this is class 1. These are the symbols of how to indicate the furcation involvement in periodontal charting. The next I will be discussing about periodontal charting, and these are the symbols that are used to actually indicate the presence of furcation involvement and the degree of the furcation involvement. If it is only like an angle symbol, then it is like a grade 1, and triangle is a grade 2 or class 2 furcation involvement. And in the mandibular molars, whenever the probe passes through and through, then it should be a classic what you call with a shaded triangle, that could be a grade 3 or class 3 furcation involvement. However, in the maxillary molars, what happens is the probe passes between the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal roots, because there are 3 roots in the maxillary molar, one palatal and one mesiobuccal and the distobuccal roots, right? So from the mesiobuccal to the distobuccal roots, like this, the probe will pass. Okay, like this the probe can pass, right? Cannot pass buccolingually because buccopalatally, because the palatal root will stop, right? Next, the class 4 furcation involvement is indicated like a diamond shape, which is also shaded. So this is the way how we indicate or we denote the presence of furcation based on the degree of the furcation involvement that is present in periodontal charting. Another important parameter, or the last parameter almost, for this assessment of the periodontal examination is attachment loss. The clinical attachment loss and the difference between the pocket depth measurement has to be clearly understood. So basically, for the periodontal pocket depth, it is actually the distance. It has to be measured from the gingival margin, as you can see here, to the base of the pocket as measured by the probe. Okay, Whereas for the clinical attachment loss, it is not the distance from the gingival margin, rather, as you can see in the picture, it is a distance from CEJ to the base of the pocket. So that this is a difference between the probing pocket depth and the attachment loss. See, attachment loss is the most reliable parameter than the probing pocket depth in assessing the amount of disease, because attachment loss always is the point of reference is always the CEJ, which is a standard point. Gingival margin won't be as standard or as clear cut, and it may not be the very standard point. It can fluctuate. The margin can move up or margin can recede down, and also it is CEJ that is more standard point to be considered as a reference point for estimating the disease severity. And the gingival recession is usually measured from I hope you know it. The gingival recession should be measured from CEJ to the gingival margin. The distance from CEJ, if at all there is recession down the gingival margin, that will be the measurement of the gingival recession. Now, the amount of clinical attachment loss, it depends upon the margin of the gingiva. How to estimate the amount of clinical attachment loss? To know the amount of clinical attachment loss, we need to know what is the amount of probing depth, right? And also where is the gingival margin in relation to the CEJ. In the situation where, if at all, in this situation, you can see the picture number 1. In this picture, the probing measurement is 6 mm. As you can see here, it is 6 mm pocket that is present. Okay, from gingival margin until the base of the pocket, you can see it is 6 mm. Now, the gingival margin to the CEJ. But here gingival margin is at the CEJ, right? It's at the same level. There is no recession, right? There is no enlargement. So gingival margin coincides with the CEJ. So in this situation, when the gingival margin level is 0, that means there is the difference between CEJ and gingival margin is 0, right? Both are the same level. So in that situation, the clinical attachment loss is nothing but from CEJ to the base of the pocket, or from margin from the base of the pocket. Both are same, since they both are at the same level. That's why cal is equal to PPD in situation number 1. Second situation is where the gingival margin is below the level of CEJ. So this is the CEJ and this is the gingival margin. So now there is a difference between the level of margin, gingival margin, and as well as the CEJ. Now, in this situation, let us say the probing depth measurement is 4 mm as given here. It is 4 mm. That means from here to base of the pocket is 4 mm, gingival margin to base of the pocket. The difference from the gingival margin level, that means from CEJ to gingival margin, is 2 mm. Now, what is cal? Cal is the measurement from CEJ to the base of the pocket. So, from CEJ to the base of the pocket. So the attachment is lost even here. The attachment is also lost even here. So total attachment loss must be this 2 plus this 4, which is equal to 6 mm. So in the case wherever there is gingival recession, the pocket depth plus recession gives you the total cal. In the third situation, where the gingival margin is not below, but rather it is above the CEJ here. So this is the gingival margin in this case, and this is the CEJ. The CEJ is at a lower level, the margin is at a higher level. In this situation, let us say the probing pocket depth measured from margin to the base of the pocket is 9 mm because the margin is at a higher level. It could be certain amount of pseudo pocket, right? So there is 9 mm pocket here, and the margin level, the gingival margin level from margin to CEJ is actually 3 mm. It is actually minus 3 mm because it is away, it's not below, right? So the clinical attachment loss is how much? The actual attachment loss always has to be calculated from CEJ to the base of the pocket. So from CEJ to the base of the pocket only we should consider. We don't consider this extra margin to CEJ level. So we have to subtract this 3 mm from the total pocket depth. So which means 9 minus 3. So the actual clinical attachment loss will be 6 millimeter. So these 3 different situations are very, very important to understand how to estimate the clinical attachment loss. There are 3 situations, as I said. 1, when the margin and the CEJ are at the same position. Number 2, when CEJ is at a higher level or margin is at a lower level. When margin is at a lower level. Situation 3, when margin is at a higher level. Okay. So, as I said, whenever there is recession, to summarize, whenever there is recession, you need to add to get the amount of cal 7 plus 2. Whenever there is gingival overgrowth, then you need to subtract in order to get the proper clinical attachment loss from the probing pocket depth. Understanding the relationship of attachment loss to pocket depth, you can observe these three pictures in A, B and C. If you see here, the pocket depth is actually around, let us say this is around a 3 mm pocket, 3 mm measurement. So 3 to 4 mm should be the pocket depth here from CEJ to the base of the pocket. Here also, if you see, the pocket measurement is the same 4 mm. Even here also the pocket measurement is the same, right? But in which situation is the clinical attachment loss is more? Which has got highest amount of clinical attachment loss? Is it A, is it B or is it C? Think about it. Attachment loss, it has to be measured from CEJ, right? So the CEJ is here, there is no attachment loss. The CEJ is here, only this much of attachment loss here. In this situation, the CEJ is here, the attachment loss is this much. So C is the one which has got a highest amount of attachment loss. Similarly, in the same picture, it is almost like the other picture, where is the gingival margin and where is the attachment loss, and which one is usually considered as a better way of treating the periodontal disease. See, if at all there is a pocket depth, same amount of attachment loss. In this situation, the attachment loss is actually the same. Okay, in this situation here, the pocket depth is PPD is constant. Here the PPD is the same, but here the calculus is same. I'm sorry, the clinical attachment loss is the same. So in the situation where all the three situations here have got same amount of cal, because the distance between the CEJ to the base of the pocket, it is constant in all the three situations. Now, which situation the probing pocket depth is more? Definitely this one, right? A has got more probing pocket depth. When we want to do periodontal treatment, which one is a better situation for us to treat, where we can expect a good outcome for the patient? This is recession. You may not be able to, there's nothing much to treat. It's already exposed root, right? The pocket won't reduce or anything. But this is a better, again, this case is also a better case for us to do a more periodontal debridement, root debridement or pocket therapies approach in order to regain the attachment. Here, the chances of gaining back the attachment could be very less, because the bone is also lost and attachment is also lost there. Now, having seen the various periodontal parameters, so far whatever we have seen are pocket depth, probing technique, and also the gingival recession, the classification of Miller classification, and the tooth mobility, and also the furcation involvement, attachment loss. All these are the 5 parameters which has to be entered and recorded in the periodontal charting, especially when the patients have got a BP score of 3 or 4. I told you need to do either sextant wise or a full mouth periodontal charting. So what is periodontal charting and what do we record in that? These are the 4 parameters, as I told you: mobility, furcation, even bleeding on probing, plaque scores, and then the CEJ or gingival margin means the gingival recession, and also the probing depth. These are the parameters usually that are recorded in the periodontal charting form. So this is an example of a periodontal charting form, how it looks, and it includes the patient name, the date, first name of the patient, date of birth, and maybe option, but the date when you record the periodontal charting is very, very important, because usually the periodontal charting is recorded before the treatment, and the reassessment after the scaling and all, we can redo the reassessment and then do the root debridement, or root debridement before proceeding to surgery also we redo the periodontal charting. So to see the follow-up of the patients, whether the pockets have improved or not, whether the attachment level has improved or not, we want to verify, then we need to look back into the periodontal charting form. So that is the reason please always, whenever you are doing the periodontal charting recording, you need to always put the date so that you can know on which date it has been recorded. If possible, also put a disease diagnosis of the patient, whether it is localized periodontitis or generalized periodontitis, important, the patient name, and whether it is initial examination or whether it is a re-evaluation you are doing on the first time charting on the patient, or you are after treatment you are actually reassessing the patient again. That also can be indicated. Now, so in the periodontal charting, what are the things that are present? Periodontal charting form has got the teeth as shown in the picture. There will be teeth in the maxillary arch. This is the buccal side. This is the lingual side or the palatal side of the maxillary arch, and the mandibular arch buccal side, lingual side, or the mandibular arch buccal side. So this is the way in this periodontal chart it is available. This periodontal chart is also available online. I have given you the links. You can go through how it is usually, how we can do this. Okay, in the periodontal charting form, what we have in MASAF in your clinic, I will show you in the next slide. So this is a bit simple periodontal charting form for the undergrad students. In our periodontal charting form, what we have usually, we have similarly the upper maxillary palatal surface, then maxillary facial surface or buccal surface, then mandibular buccal surface here, and the mandibular lingual surface here. So what are the things that has to be recorded? The things, the parameters that has to be recorded include recession and pocket depth, and also the furcation, which grade and which surface have got the furcation. For example, sometimes furcation might be present only on the buccal surface, but lingual surface there may not be any furcation, right? Maxillary molars, there are three furcations. One is buccal furcation, mesiobuccal furcation, and distobuccal or distopalatal furcation. So either of it could be involved, right? Or all three could be involved. So which areas are involved, also which surface has got furcation also to be indicated, and which grade, whether it is class 1, class 2, which grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 or grade 4 has to be indicated. Mobility of the teeth, if at all any teeth is mobile, also have to be mentioned. The mobility grade 1, grade 2 or grade 3 has to be indicated in these boxes. So you write the mobility 1, and then for example, where you're talking about the maxilla, this is the mobility parameter you record here. You record the pocket depth here, you record the recession here, you record the furcation and the grading here, right? Plaque score and bleeding score also, full mouth plaque score, full mouth bleeding score can also be indicated. You can do here, but for us in clinic, in the MASA clinic, we have separate form for the plaque score and bleeding score. But most of the chartings generally usually have plaque score and bleeding score also in the same form as you have seen just before. Okay, and another important aspect is, while you are recording the periodontal charting form, you need to record, as I said, probing have to be recorded on 6 sites, isn't it? So 6 sites per tooth. So for the maxilla, 1, 2 and 3, there will be 3 measurements here, maybe 5 mm, 4 mm, 3 mm on the buccal surface, and the same tooth on the palatal surface may have 3 other readings. So totally it will be 6 readings per tooth surface. Recession is also have to be recorded on 3 plus 3 6 surfaces on both buccal 3 surfaces and palatal 3 surfaces, be like mid buccal, mesiobuccal and distobuccal. Similarly, mid palatal, mesiopalatal and distopalatal of each tooth surface have to be recorded. Total of 6 probing measurements of recession and pocket depth have to be recorded for all the teeth, in case if it is a generalized periodontitis. If it's generalized everywhere, it is 4, then definitely you need to record a full mouth periodontal charting. Okay, only after you identify, if you complete the full mouth periodontal charting as you measure with the walking technique of the probe, as you measure the gingival recession, once these things are where there is furcation, which teeth is mobile, once you will have a complete clear blueprint picture of whatever the patient status is, right? Then you will identify which are the teeth which have got pocket depth of 4 to 5 mm shallow pockets or greater than 6 mm. You can highlight the pockets that are more than 6 mm, and accordingly you will make your treatment plan, whether they require root debridement or surgical periodontal treatment, etc. Okay, so it is very important to have a clear cut idea of which even when you do the root debridement, which you don't know which teeth you have to do the root debridement, which surface has got the pocket. So once you do the periodontal charting, it will indicate, see for example, there could be a pocket of here, for example there is a 2 mm and 5 mm and 7 mm, right, on this canine, let us say. And here for the same tooth canine, the pocket depth may not be there on the palatal surface 1, 3 and 1. So 2, 5, 7. So the pocket is actually present on the mid buccal and the mesiobuccal surface of the canine. So that is the area where I need to do the debridement. Okay. So that helps you to identify the actual pocket sites. Now we have come to the radiographs. The clinical assessment or clinical examination of all the periodontal findings have been covered so far, including pocket, plaque score, oral hygiene or BPE or the recession, furcation, mobility, all have been now covered, and even including charting and how to estimate the attachment loss in the charting I have shown you. Now let me tell you, before we diagnose, all these are important because ultimately we want to have a diagnosis and a good treatment plan, right? So for that we also, of course, we require to take a radiograph sometimes. So when we should take a radiograph and what information should we get the radiograph, let us see from a periodontal point of view which are the important aspects to be understood. See, for providing, basically radiographs are indicated whenever there is a BP score of 3 or BP score of 4. Definitely we can go for taking a full mouth radiographs, especially for a BP score of 4. Now full mouth series or full mouth radiographs include 14 PAs and 4 bite wings. These are the 4 bite wings, as you can see here. These are the 4 bite wing radiographs, and then all the rest are the PAs. All these are the maxillary and mandibular PA radiographs. To completely analyze the bone loss everywhere, you require 14 PAs and 4 bite wings. So this usually the radiographs indicate the difference between the crest of the alveolar crest and endographic appearance ranges from 0.0 to 1.6 mm, and the distance between the CEJ, usually the distance between the CEJ and the crest of the bone is estimated to be always, it is around 2 mm in a healthy periodontium, in a normal healthy periodontium. Okay, let us go into the kind of radiographs we may require and what features we need to identify from the radiographs. So to start with briefly, according to the BSP guidelines, the British Society of Periodontology guidelines, when to take a radiograph for a patient who you suspect to have periodontitis. So clinically, when you suspect the patient is probably has probing pocket depths of deeper pockets, then you think the patient may have periodontitis. But if it is a localized periodontitis, it is not necessary to really take a radiograph, right? So when you suspect a generalized periodontitis, then possibly it is important. As a general guide, radiographs for periodontal assessment will be needed with the BPE codes of 3, 4 and asterisk to assess the extent of bone loss. Okay, so usually you may choose to take radiograph as a part of your special investigations on completion of the BPE. If necessary, usually it is important to take a periodontal chart which allows you to help additional information, and then you can think whether you really require a radiograph or not. But if not, if it is straight away clear-cut case of generalized periodontitis, you may with BP4 everywhere, then you can take a panoramic radiograph as well. So what to look for in a radiograph for a periodontitis patient or a periodontitis case? We can observe the presence of PDL space widening. We can see the pattern of the bone loss and the extent of the bone loss, whether there is horizontal or angular bone loss, whether there is it is extending only at the coronal third, middle third, or until the apical third of the root length. We can also see for the presence of the furcation bone loss. We can also see any proximal or root caries, generally any periapical radiolucencies, any open contacts can also be observed, any unerupted teeth, impactions, anything, overhang margins, which clinically sometimes we may overlook and be observed through the radiographs, and any endoperioral lesions and any other abnormal findings that are related can be observed in the using the radiographs. Now let me show you an example. Here it is a panoramic image of a patient with periodontitis. Now let us see what are the findings that you need to observe in a case of periodontitis patient. As you can see in this patient, there is generalized horizontal bone loss that is observed both in the maxillary and mandibular arches, and then the bone loss is extending until around beyond middle third to a junction of middle and apical third, or I would say it is middle third of the bone loss extends until roughly around the middle third on both the arches. However, there is angular bone loss, or what you call that is vertical bone loss, present in the tooth 1-7 extending until the apical third or apex of the root in relation to 1-7. There is also a furcation bone loss present in 1-7. Vertical bone loss is also observed here in the tooth which is 2-4, and also on the tooth it looks like 2-7 to me, it looks like 2-6 is missing. So extending until the apex of the root again. There could be a grade 1 or grade 2 furcation present in this tooth 2-7. Here also you can observe there is angular bone loss interdentally present in the tooth 3-6, there is bone loss present like this, and there is also a furcation involvement, looks like around grade 2 furcation here also, right? So, and we can also observe that there is missing 4-6 and impacted 4-8 and as well as 3-8. And we can also observe that there is subgingival calliculus deposit. See, you might see these are the, I highlight with the another color. So this is the subgingival flex, which are indicative of the subgingival calliculus deposits. You can also observe here, these are the subgingival deposits, or subgingival calliculus is seen like this. Okay, you can also see that there are some open contact here, open contacts. Of course, this is very obvious, open contact here. This is also open contact. Okay, this eventually will cause supra-eruption, as we discussed about supra-eruption and the drifting of the teeth, right? So here also is open contact, as you can see in all these areas. All right, there are multiple open contacts that are present, right? And here also there is a vertical bone loss, almost extend, or there is a peridilucency, or there could be a widening of the pedial space that can be observed in the relation to the tooth, the canine, that is 4-3. Right, so roughly like this, we need to identify, even this is a subgingival calliculus, it goes on. So like this, we usually try to analyze the panoramic image, but important is whenever you're talking about horizontal bone loss, tell, or you need to explain until which level the bone loss is in relation to the root length, whether it is middle third, apical third, or coronal third, or whether it is a vertical bone loss extends, and it is sometimes it could be circumferential bone loss everywhere and beyond the root apex also the bone loss is lost. You have to accordingly specify. Hence, to summarize, periodontally, the radiographs should be assessed for the degree of the bone loss, and also to see whether the apex is visible. Then the bone loss should be measured and reported as percentage of bone loss also. In a PA, especially with using a periapical radiograph, you can see the amount of bone loss you have to calculate. You can measure from the CEJ the root length. Right, you have to measure first. This is the root length measurement. You can see that is the Y is the total root length, that is you supposed to be covered within the bone, right? It's supposed to have completely the bone, that is Y, and X is the measurement from CEJ to the crust of the bone. So this is the loss of bone. Loss of bone by total bone is nothing but the total root length, right? So the X by Y times 100, that gives you the percentage of bone loss. Okay, you also have to usually we estimate the percentage of bone loss in the worst tooth in order to give the diagnosis of the patient or the grading of the patient as per the new classification, whether it is grade A, B or C. Okay, so the pattern or type of bone loss, whether it is horizontal or angular bony defects, presence of furcation, subgingival calliculus, other features like widened pedial spaces, abnormal root length, morphology, curvatures, overhangs, perioindolations, a lot more information we can assess using the radiographs, which radiographs basically help us to confirm the clinical findings and to see what probably something which we have missed out, and also to it will be helping us to in order to decide the treatment plan. If at all we were not sure clinically whether the tooth has to be retained or to be extracted, but after taking a radiograph you are quite sure that there is no bone supporting the tooth, then maybe you suggest for an extraction, and accordingly you plan your treatment of prosthesis, extraction and prosthesis or something else, right? So it depends. Or if you think there is good amount of bone for the tooth and it can be salvaged, then you will try to do some periodontal surgical therapy and then try to save the tooth, or you may want to do an RCT if it is an endoperio case accordingly. So basically the treatment plan, to confirm your findings and to make a treatment plan, a radiograph is very, very important. Sometimes in some of the periapical radiographs, the amount of bone loss could be underestimated, and as you can see here in this picture up here, the radiographic bone loss is showing like that. It looks like only the bone loss is around the coronal third alone, but actual bone loss, when you take a bite wing, it will be clearer, and that's why you can see the bone loss is extending almost beyond the coronal third. Ideally it is almost sometimes around the middle third also. So it could be underestimated in a PA radiograph sometimes. Okay, And here also you can see, of course, this is a 2D image, right, for 3D bone and 3D tooth surface. So we can clearly identify the in proximal bone and proximal bone loss and all, but the bone that is present on the buccal side, on the lingual side, it is usually overlapped by the root, right? It is, so that's why we cannot clearly distinguish it. But you can see in this picture, this horizontal, this lines, this horizontal lines actually indicate the, if you closely observe, this is the horizontal line that indicates the level of the bone on the buccal surface. Sometimes it looks like the tooth is healthy because the bone is until here, only this much amount of bone loss there, but actually the bone loss is extending like this until here. So the bone looks good interdentally, but on the mid-buccal surface or on the mid-palatal surface there could be bone loss. If there is bone loss only on the mid-palatal or mid-buccal surface, probing is a better way to identify. Radiographs may or may not clearly be able to distinguish the amount of bone loss, but these horizontal lines are one such way to identify the buccal or the palatal bone loss. Again, as I said, in such situations where the bone loss is not clearly indicative on the buccal surfaces or on the palatal surfaces, you can use, because you can probe it clinically, that makes you, or that gives you a suspicion that there could be a bone loss on the facial surface, right? Then you can use a GP point or Guttapercha point and put the Guttapercha point into the periodontal pocket on the mid-buccal surface, and then it goes until the base of the pocket. So it shows that the bone loss is until this level. Then you can decide what should be the prognosis of the tooth and what should be the treatment plan. So if at all on the mid-buccal or the mid-palatal surface you are unable to identify the amount of bone loss clearly, definitely because of the root that is overlapping, then you can use the GP point through the pocket, and then you can take a PA like this. Okay, this will help you in order to see the amount of bone loss. Okay. Here, another point of unable to identify the periodontal finding in a radiograph is the furcation bone loss of the maxillary molars. For instance, the mandibular molar, identifying the furcation is not a great deal. It can be easily identified. But here you can see it is partially obscured by the external oblique ridge passing there. The third molar also has a furcation, but it's not very well clearly defined. There is a furcation involvement on all the three teeth. Whereas in the maxillary molar, because there is a palatal root and the teeth have got, the palatal root is overlapping again, so the furcation may not be so obvious, but you can see this indicates, this is called furcation arrow, this indicates the presence of furcation involvement. Finally, to summarize, in this lecture, we have actually gone through in detail about how to do the periodontal probing depth and what is the technique of assessment and what is pseudo pocket or periodontal pocket measurements. This chart I have put here for you so that you can read through each of these findings about recession, inadequate gingiva, cal, pocket depth, and how the techniques can be assessed. I have just summarized. I got it from a textbook and I put it here. And this picture actually shows you the WHO probe, and this is a nice picture that shows you how much of probing force you need to apply when you want to probe. It is just when you apply on your tooth nail, but it should be just giving you a nice blanching. So that blanching whenever is there, that is the amount of force, that much is the amount of force that is enough to verify the presence of the pocket or to measure the pocket depth. Don't need to apply a more amount of probing force. Okay, so this is also again a summary of the periodontal BPE. When you do what is supposed to be the investigations that are required when BPE is done, and what assessment and follow-up and how to be done, it is all given in this sheet. You can go through as a summary of the lecture today. Finally, using all the parameters, assessment of the patient has been done, and you get a lot of information now. You know the periodontal charting, you know what is the pocket depth, you know the attachment loss, maybe you have the radiographs, everything. Finally, you need to arrive at a diagnosis. So what is the protocol to arrive at a diagnosis? I have a small flow chart to go through. You have done the history, you have done the extraoral examination, intraoral examination. Then if you find there is evidence of periodontitis or not, you know based on the BPE. If you suspect there is no evidence of, for example, if you think there is no evidence of periodontitis, just do the BPE and then if the BP scores are 3 or 4, in that case you suspect periodontitis, right? If there is no score of BP 3 or 4, it is only a gingivitis usually. That also depends upon the bleeding, whether there is gingivitis or it is healthy. If the BOP is less than 10%, that means it is periodontally healthy patient. Okay, if at all the BOP, the bleeding on probing, full mouth bleeding score, it is actually greater than 30%, then it is probably it is a generalized gingivitis. If it is in between 10 to 30%, it is a localized gingivitis. This I have told you when I was covering about the bleeding score. So this is about whenever the BP scores are 0, 1 or 2, and then the BOP is the one that decides whether it has got, if the patient is healthy or the patient has got a gingivitis based on the bleeding scores. Now, let us say if you're suspecting periodontitis, or even if the BP scores of 3 or 4 are present, ultimately what you're supposed to do? Then you can take appropriate radiographs, okay, or you can, if at all there is a BP score of 4, then in such situations you can do initial periodontal treatment of scaling and prophylaxis, and then you should do a full mouth periodontal charting. You may take radiographs before or after, and then you can accordingly, based on the amount of bone loss and based upon your periodontal charting findings, you will do whether that if at all more than 30% of the teeth are involved with pockets or less than 30% of the teeth are involved with the pockets. If at all less than 30% of the teeth are involved with the pocket depth, then it is localized periodontitis. If it is more than that, then it will be a generalized periodontitis. Molar incisor pattern, we say only when there is pocket depths or bone loss present only in the molars and the incisors, first molars and incisors. Then in that case we say that the type of pattern of bone loss is molar incisor pattern, and accordingly the periodontitis is also periodontitis with molar incisor pattern, we will call it as. Okay, accordingly once you confirm it is generalized periodontitis, you proceed with your staging and your risk factor assessment of diabetes and smoking, and you grade the patient. That's when you get ultimately the diagnosis and you proceed for your treatment planning. I hope this flowchart is a nice one which gives you a complete summary and the picture of all whatever we have discussed in the two parts. Ultimately is to get into a proper diagnosis, and how to arrive at diagnosis also I have given you a flowchart. Let us see how much you have gained about this topic, and then we have a later one more tutorial later on how to arrive at a diagnosis on applying the new classification, staging and grading, where I can give you some case-based analysis. I hope you all have enjoyed this lecture. One more important point before I sign out is this, any case you do in your clinics, important is case documentation. For case study documentation, it is always necessary to have your clinical photographs as an important, possibly the study models have to be taken, radiographs, and also the periodontal indices and the periodontal chartings. All these things are important for a proper case documentation and follow-up of a patient. Good morning, dear students. I hope you have enjoyed. I thank you all for the patient watching of these videos. There are some more videos which we have. I thank the seniors who have helped me in making compilation of this blended learning. I hope this kind of teaching approach you do appreciate, or I want your feedback, a genuine feedback, to see how much this has helped you, what are the pros and cons of this approach, and accordingly we strive to continue further, improve further, and deliver the better for you and the best out of us. Thank you so much. All the best. Good luck.